Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast, Managing Tribal Construction Projects. I'm happy to introduce today's speakers, Peder Jensen and Deveau. Peder focuses on construction controls and construction performance audits for clients in a variety of industries. He has worked extensively with corporate assessment teams, regularly visiting project sites, evaluating internal controls, and assisting with large contract changes. Peder is a certified construction auditor. Brian is a Tribal and Gaming National Practice Leader at Moss Adams. He focuses on serving tribal governments as well as tribal gaming enterprises, tribal housing and utility authorities, and other tribal organizations. Before joining Moss Adams, Brian served for 9 years as the finance director for 2 tribes. Drawing on deep experience, he provides tribal clients with practical, proven solutions to their unique challenges. Along with audit services, he consults on a variety of issues, including management of indirect costs, financial analysis, and improving organizational effectiveness. Brian, I will now turn the line over to you to begin today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Pam, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining our webcast. We think it's going to be a very valuable one for you. Before we get started on the content, just a brief introduction for those of you who aren't familiar with Moss Adams. We're the largest CPA and consulting firm that's headquartered on the West Coast. We've been around since 1913, and one of our areas of practice, although we're a full-service firm, we do a lot of construction audits that provide millions of dollars in savings to project owners each year. Some of the type of projects that we focus on in our construction auditing include administration buildings, medical facilities, casino expansion, hotels, and many other types of projects. We have been working with tribes for many years, for about 35 years now, and we currently serve over 130 tribal organizations around the country. So it's a big part of our practice. So in today's discussion, we're gonna cover common construction risks and questions, and most importantly, controls that you should have in place. Obviously, tribes have a lot at stake in construction projects. We know that most of the time there's very limited resources available for capital projects. It's public money. You're accountable to your membership for the use of those funds. So you've got an obligation to ensure that the tribe's interests are protected and that you get the very best value for your very scarce funds. So unfortunately, tribes have been victimized in some cases by poor construction projects, as well as many cases not getting the value that was hoped for. So we're here to try to help you overcome that and get some tips to prevent that from happening, to ensure that your tribe gets full value for your projects. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, we have a polling question. So again, to get CPE credit for this session, you'll need to answer 3 of the 4 polling questions, including potentially this one. So do you have a construction project going? Yes, in the planning. Yes, in construction. Yes, recently finished. So please click on your answer. We'll give it about 5 more seconds. Click the submit button once you select your answer, and then we'll take a look at the results. So yeah, just about half of you are in the planning phase, and another third approximately. So gosh, 80% of you have a project that is going right now. So again, we're glad to hear that. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Peder Jensen. Peder, help us better understand what can tribes do to ensure that they're getting full value from their projects. So what are some of the risks and exposures that tribes face?
Thanks a lot, Brian. What we're going to cover is we're going to start with a lot of the risks that are on some of the projects that you guys are going to face, and then we're going to transition more into the details of what the specific costs are and the risks associated with those costs throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we're going to talk kind of more about the control environment, what controls you guys can put in place to ensure your project comes in on time, at budget, with the scope you desire. And really, the list of exposures and risks we see here. Really, when we talk about construction risk, we're talking about three things: budget, scope, and schedule. How do you create a project and a control environment where you can ensure that the budget you have, the scope, is adequate for the scope you want with the right quality and come in on schedule? And as we talk through this presentation, we're going to try to address a lot of these different items. And we'll talk about specific examples that we've seen with each one of these throughout the presentation of where owners or tribes have gotten in trouble because they didn't have a control in place, or they were taken advantage of, or they didn't fully understand what their contract said, or that they thought they were covered, and it just didn't happen that way. And really, each project's different. When we talk to people about projects, there's no one size that fits all as far as control environment or any of these items. Really, contract type is a huge determining factor of it. There's really, we see two major types of contracts. One, we're going to refer to a lot of this, is called a GMP, which is a guaranteed maximum price contract, which basically is a cost reimbursable contract up to a maximum amount. The contract should specifically spell out what costs are allowable and what costs are not allowable. The other type of contract we see is lump sum contracts. Lump sum contracts, it's a lot more important to have the controls around the bidding side of the project, because once you lock into that amount, that's how much you're going to pay for the scope. There's not going to be the cost reimbursable side of the project. Understanding your owner construction experience, your project staffing, and your own organization's aptitude for risk, and where you want to take on risk and where you don't want to take on certain risk. So these are some questions that you should be asking yourself at the beginning of the project and throughout the project about controls if you should have in place. Ensure contracts include most favorable pricing. Really what you're trying to do here is, do you have controls around your contracts, around your approvals, whether it's change order approval, it's pay application approval, it's initial pricing approval, and then what controls do you have around management and the information that you're getting related to the project? Are you expecting to get monthly updates, but it wasn't laid out in the beginning with the contractor that you'd be getting a monthly update? How are you reviewing what kind of costs are coming into your project? These are all controls that you should be asking yourself at the beginning of the project. A few others. Authorize. A lot of times we see on projects with tribes, they don't, because it's so infrequent of when they have a big project, that they try to go at a big project the same way they would go after a small project. So for example, we dealt with a tribe that had a $45 million construction of a new casino. They tried to approach it with their same facilities management that is basically a maintenance function, that's ongoing maintenance, and they use the same controls they have for ongoing maintenance. They tried to apply to a $45 million project. There's a big gap in some of the areas, and a lot of these areas are some of these controls we're bringing up. How do you address reviewing a payment application? How do you, all of a sudden you're getting a payment application for $2 million a month, which, payment application is the monthly invoice the contractor provides to you, the tribe, to get paid. How do you review a $2 million payment application when usually your biggest project was $2 million? So there's a lot of things that you want to consider at the beginning of the project. And again, you're thinking, how does this thing close out effectively?
So here we have a second polling question. Pam?
Yes, so for the second polling question, hope take some time to answer this question. What is the most significant risk of your tribe's project? Budget, schedule, scope, change orders, compliance, or maybe it's all of the above. So as Brian mentioned earlier, if you'd like CPE credit, you'll need to answer these polling questions. So yeah, if you just take a few minutes to answer the question. And we'll give it just a few more seconds here, and we'll close the poll. And yep, so just a few more seconds, and I think we'll go ahead and close the polling questions. I think we've got most responses in. So let's take a look at the results.
Great.
Well, not really a surprise. A lot of potential problems. And Peter, as you we're talking about controls here a second ago, it kind of got me to thinking a little bit. When we talk to tribes about their upcoming construction projects and we ask about controls and processes that are in place, a lot of times what we hear from tribes is, oh, well, my architect is doing that, or oh, my third-party project manager is doing that. And yet when we probe further, we find that, again, perhaps those controls really aren't in place and that no one really is monitoring to the level that you're discussing. So can you go over what is the optimal project team and the roles of each of these folks?
Yeah, so I think the best way to go over it is to talk about, one is the different people that we see part of projects, and then talk about what is the optimal role. And that's going to be dependent on some factors, but really here are the main parties in a construction project. You have the owner and the tribe, which the owner is you, the tribe. The facilities and construction department, a lot of times, is a mix of either the facilities construction department that is underneath the tribe government, or that they hire a third-party project manager to manage the project. A lot of times there's an architect involved. Of course, the general contractor is the main contractor, and then they hire, usually 60 to 80% of their work goes directly to subcontractors, and then usually there's an auditor involved also. A lot of times we get the question around, well, we have a project manager that's looking over payment applications, or I have both a project manager and an architect who review payment applications. Really understanding and at the beginning of the project and understanding the roles of each people and defining those clearly as what the expectations are for each one of those is key. And why I say this is, the reason you have a third-party project manager and an architect look over change orders and look over payment applications, and potentially have an auditor look over it as well, each one serves a different function. The architect is really looking at it at a design and constructability standpoint. Have they completed as much work as they said they've done? Project management is really looking at the project usually as a whole. They're managing, they're making sure change orders are getting processed timely. They're making sure the contractor is staying on schedule. And then an auditor is really looking at it, is the billings that they're supplying or the change order that they're submitting, does it comply with the contract terms for cost allowability? I would say 90% of the projects we work on as an audit firm have a project manager and have an architect who are also part of it. And really the most effective, when we talked about optimization, the facilities and construction department and the owner and the tribe, if they do have a third party, it's key to have the communication and the approval structure set up at the beginning of the project. You don't want the third party project manager approving change orders, most likely. You want that to be something that goes through either your facilities department or through your tribe, so you understand what costs you're allowing and what costs you're approving. You want them to do a review, and potentially you want your auditor to do a review of those costs, but you want to be the approver of those. And that's the same for a general contractor approving subcontractor invoices. Each one has their own place on the project team. So this is when we approach a cost project or a cost audit for a construction project. There's different silos of cost, and these are the different silos we see on a traditional GMP or guaranteed maximum price contracts: fees, general conditions, insurance and bond, labor and related labor burden, subcontracts, equipment, which is both rental equipment, contractor-owned and third-party rentals, change orders, and then the final is going to be the right to audit cost. So we're going to go through each one of these in detail, and I'm going to give some specifics on risks that you should be aware of, and also things that you guys can do to hopefully eliminate some of that risk. So starting with the general contractor fee, and really what the fee is this is the profit and overhead for the general contractor. There's some keys to this and things that should be included in the fee and things that shouldn't be included in the fee. And we highlighted here a couple of the things that you want to exclude from the fee. So usually the way fee is calculated is based on a percentage of the total contract. But really, using those terms, total contract, can be a little bit loose because there's things that should be excluded outside of the fee, such as insurance, performance bonds, any applicable taxes. This could be B&O tax in the state of Washington, tribal tax, could be any of these items, permits, and self-perform work. And the reason self-perform work, and I'm going to touch on that one, we've seen a big issue with this, is when you have a general contractor who also self-performs some work. So for example, your general contractor wants to do the concrete work on the project. We're going to talk about this when we talk about subcontracting as well, but if they include a fee on top of it, they're basically going to be double dipping in fee. They're going to be paying a fee on their fee. So that's one that we always like to say exclude from the general contractor fee, because when they bid the subcontractor package, that already is going to have a fee on it most likely. And really, basing the fee on a percentage and not a lump sum is also another key. In a standard AIA contract, which AIA is probably the most standard contract out there that most tribes use and most cross-industries use in a GMP setting. It's specific that it needs to be based on percentage of work and not on a lump sum. When this comes up is when there's a change order, is that you want that fee to be the same across. So if there's a change order that increases the project by $500,000, then their fee is related to that. They shouldn't get more fee, they shouldn't get less fee. It's a fair way of doing it. When you base it on a lump sum amount, you can get really convoluted quickly on what fee should be associated with change orders, or if there's a deductive change order, which we see in a lot of different projects where there's increases and decreases. It's very clear what the fee what should happen with the fee. Another important point about the fee is make sure it's clear what the fee includes and excludes. And we're going to talk about that in the general conditions. So general conditions, these are what are traditionally also called indirect costs. In a standard AIA document, again, there is a couple sections in Article 7, which is the allowable cost section, which outlines some of this. But really, this should be something that you should get at the beginning of the project from the general contractors, talk to them. And what we like to see is a general conditions kind of a matrix showing what costs they included in their estimate for these things, because these are the costs that are going to go directly to the general contractor. A lot of times, relocation, safety incentives, meals and entertainment, we like to see those get excluded from the allowable cost. Those are items that the general contractor should include in their fee when they're bidding the project, but they shouldn't be paid for this project. And really, we see this, I'd probably say half the tribes I've worked with, it's come up where they've always said it's industry standard. The contractor always pushes back saying this is industry standard, that this cost is included. It's industry standard that we can include our accounting personnel in the general conditions. And industry standard is a term that you hear a lot thrown out, but really what matters is what's in the contract and what's not in the contract. Industry standards is a way, I feel, of them trying to say, hey, we're the contractors, we do this all the time. We know we want this cost. As the owner, you have the right to determine what's in your contract and what's not in your contract. And really, that beginning setting up the controls is key to setting what costs are allowable and what costs are not allowable. Insurance and bond costs, so this is also general conditions costs. Insurance costs are going to be something that's part of the work, but understanding what insurance that are required and what are not required. A lot of different organizations, we've seen them take SubGuard, which SubGuard is general contractor has SubGuard for each one of its subs to make sure it performs the work. It basically takes the place of the performance bond of the subcontractors. What you don't want to see is you don't want to see the general contractor charging for SubGuard and then the subs charging for performance bonds, because that's basically covering the same thing that the sub performs and does its work that it says it's going to do. And we were working with a tribe in California where they were getting charged for general liability, SubGuard, and performance bonds for each one of the subs. And basically, so you're getting 3 times the coverage when really only one's affected, but you're paying for it 3 times. I think it was about a $220,000 issue where the tribe overpaid and had to get a credit back because really they didn't need to have a SubGuard and performance bond. And a lot of times you'll hear the terms OSIP or CSIP. OSIP is Owner-Controlled Insurance Program, and CSIP is a Contractor-Controlled Insurance Program. Really the reasons for having these is to get, on big projects, it can help get a better rate for all the subs across the project. A lot of times your smaller subs have a higher insurance rate if they have a bad history, have had bonding issues, anything like that. So occasionally you'll see on big projects where the owner will get an OSIP or the contractor will get a CSIP. For an OSIP, obviously that's going to be managed by your tribe and you should have internal controls around that. If your contractor gets a CSIP, it's really important that you have visibility to make sure that the subs aren't charging for any kind of insurance, because they should all be covered by the CSIP program. And also having the right to audit that CSIP program is a big deal, because the general contractor is usually doing a CSIP for its own interest. 1, it can manage its own insurance, and 2, that it can be a profit center, and that if they can lock in a fee, let's say a 2% CSIP fee, and then their CSIP is actually 0.8%, there's a lot of chance here. And that we were dealing with another tribe that this was about 2 years ago, where the contractor charged for a CSIP program, but ended up saying that they were self-insured. So basically there was no real cost the tribe took, or that the contractor took. But they charged the tribe, it was $450,000. They charged the tribe for the CSIP program, but they called themselves self-insured, and really they didn't have any insurance policy on the project. And if there was an issue, those costs probably would have been translated back to the tribe anyway. So it's very, if the CSIP is involved, specific contract language should be added. 1, so that the tribe has the right to review it, but 2, so that they can verify that those costs are real costs and what's covered in that CSIP meets what the contract requires. And then the general liability insurance, SubGuard, CSIP, any bond or insurance rates should be stipulated in the contract, so that it's very clear on change orders what's allowable, and also what's allowable for subs. The next cost silo, labor and labor burden. Out of all the issues we see on projects, probably labor and burden and change orders are the 2 biggest areas that have issues. Partly because they're some of the biggest costs on the project. Hopefully change orders aren't, but a lot of times they can get, they're unexpected and can really build up quickly. But labor and burden, really labor is broken into 2 different types. There's the project management, and then there's the craft labor. Craft labor are actually the people performing the project, performing work on the project. Project management is usually only with the general contractor, and it's the engineers, the project manager, accounting personnel. And then there's 2 methods that we traditionally see on projects on how they reimburse for labor. Actual costs, so the actual costs incurred by the general contractor are reimbursed, or stipulated rates. Actual rates or actual costs, I would say, is the preferred method, because you're actually going to pay what you incur. For stipulated rates, locking those rates in, The key is if you are going to do stipulated rates, there are advantages because it's much easier to review on a monthly basis when the rates are. But being able to see what's in those rates before you agree to them is very important. Anything that you're going to lock into a rate or a lump sum, it's very important to review beforehand, because once you lock into that either it's the rate or it's the lump sum amount, it locks that. That's no longer reviewable. It is what it is. In stipulated rates, one thing we see is that a lot of times they have built-in escalations with them. Be very wary of the escalations and how it's written in the contract, what the escalation is. A lot of times we try to stay away from the escalations, but depending on how much pushback there is from the contractor. If you are using stipulated rates, make sure you understand what is in that rate and what's not in that rate. We're dealing with a project right now where the owner has stipulated rates in the contract. They were reviewed and negotiated at the beginning of the project, but now all of a sudden the general contractor is charging for additional things that the owner thought was part of the stipulated rate, but they didn't adjust the language in the contract to clearly stipulate what was in that rate. So things per diem and car allowance. So each employee now, I think there's 10 or so people on the project management staff are getting per diem and car allowance. So it's about an extra $1,000 to $1,500 a month per staff person, which is $10,000 a month for the whole staff over the course of the project. It could be well over $1 million in per diem and car allowance that the owner didn't think was going to be part of the contract costs, but it wasn't clearly defined in the contract that those things should have been included in the labor rate. And then also the burden side of it is very important. That's why paying actuals can sometimes be very good, because what you'll get to see is you'll get to see what the company's actually paying for labor burden and what's allowable. We see a lot of issues with labor burden where all of a sudden employees are getting overtime, but the burden is increasing just as much as the labor rate is, which is not right, because there's certain things in labor burden that don't increase with overtime. In individual instances, it can be very small dollars, but when it's added up over a project, and a project can easily have 1 million man hours in it, can result in significant dollars. Subcontracts, really it's the bulk cost of the project. Most subcontracts are lump sum. Sometimes you'll see GMP subcontracts. If you do have GMP subcontracts, usually they're for mechanical, electrical, HVAC, fire suppression work. Really the key is making sure the general contractor is doing their job as general contractor, reviewing those costs. Those costs should have flow-through rates through your contract. So the allowability, for cost allowability and cost that's not allowable. And anytime your general contractor is going to self-perform work, you should review those bid packages. Make sure that those are competitively bid just like every other bid package on the project. A lot of times we see general contractors saying, well, we didn't want to bid that because that's something we traditionally self-perform. Right, but if the concrete work is something you traditionally self-perform, but it was $200,000 more to have you self-perform it yourself than having XYZ concrete subcontractor, we should know that. Also having the right to review the general contractor's bidding is very important. Being able to review how they put jobs out to bid for the subcontractor work packages is important. Equipment. As I mentioned previously, that there's really two forms of equipment. There's contractor-owned equipment and there's third-party rental equipment. Contractor-owned are things that they own and they charge on a monthly basis to the project. Third-party rental equipment is things that they'll rent from a United Rentals or Sun Rentals. A lot of times those are very easy to review, and easy as far as allowability because there's an invoice for those. It's almost like a direct cost. The thing that you have to be more wary about is contractor-owned equipment. Now, this can be very good for you as an owner, or it could be very bad for you as an owner. And I used to work for a general contractor. I spent about 8 years working for a general contractor, and this was one area where we made a lot of money is with our rental equipment. For general contractors, will charge the project, and a lot of times we'll review contracts where there's the owner, the tribe will reimburse up to 150% of the net value or the total value of the piece of equipment. And so what that means is if the general contractor has a $20,000 pickup truck at the beginning of the project, that they can charge $30,000 in rent to the project, and then they still get to own the project, the pickup truck at the end. Really, what we like to see is a total cap rental payment based off a percentage of the fair market value. A lot of times we recommend that percentage be somewhere between 50 and 75% of the fair market value of that piece of equipment. And fair market value is the starting value minus the salvage at the end of the project. This is something that in the traditional AIA document gets owners in a lot of trouble because there is no cap in it. There is no limit to it. So really, as long as the monthly rental rate is determined, if the project gets extended an extra year, which we've seen, we're working with a project right now in the Midwest, and I think there's $600,000 in overcharged equipment where they've charged over 100% of the value of the equipment. We've seen simple things like laptops where they've charged $12,000 over the course of the project for a $1,500 laptop. Pickup trucks that have been $70,000 of rent been charged to the project. So these can add up real quickly. And having controls in the contract and also understanding the general contractor and working with the general contractor at the beginning of the project really, for this one, can limit your exposure on the back end.
And Peter, this is Brian again. Hey, if a tribe doesn't address this up front in the contract, is it too late to prevent some of these sort of abuses from going on? I mean, obviously that sounds very scary to find that tribes may be way overpaying for these rental costs. So if it's not clearly spelled out in the contract, would tribes still have recourse once the project is started for issues like this?
Yeah, so that's a great question because there's a couple different things a tribe can do once let's say right now we're halfway through a project. First thing I would encourage is read through your contract, understand what your contract says, what's allowable and what's not allowable. So if there is no cap on equipment, sitting down with the general contractor where you still have leverage is key. The project I was just speaking about in the Midwest, the problem is the project is finished and they brought us in to do an audit at the very end of the project when they've already paid all this cost. And so they lost a significant amount of their leverage. Is once you've paid all the money, your leverage is very low. But when you're in the middle point of a project or even 3/4 way through, looking at how much has totally been billed over the project for rent and going to the contractor and talking to them about that, it's a lot more likely where you can get something in place, whether it's via change order or working with the owner on where we can cap the billings, or the contractor where you can cap the billings, is critical. So yes, you definitely can. Identifying, and that's one thing is if you're reviewing pay-in applications as they come in, like your project manager is probably doing, you see a pickup truck and for $800 a month for rent, that seems reasonable. But then if you look at it over a 30-month project, that pickup truck is now $25,000 worth of total rent's been charged to the project. So looking at it over the course of the project and you can even request the general contractor when they submit their billings includes total rent charged to the project so that that cap is very aware. And then there's additional costs with rental equipment that you want to understand how it's going to be applied to the project, because maintenance costs. If the project involves a lot of civil work at the beginning, dirt work, and they put a bulldozer on the project at the beginning and it blows an engine, that shouldn't be your cost. That engine has 4,000 to 6,000 hours on a Caterpillar bulldozer. It didn't go bad just because it was on your project. So understanding what maintenance costs are allowable and what costs aren't. Obviously, if a pickup truck is driving and it needs new tires and it's been on your project for 2 years, that would be that would be a reasonable expense. But a new engine or a new transmission probably is not. And also, having the contractor fully support for any costs that they're billing to your project, you should be able to ask for full support for it. And don't be satisfied by seeing an intercompany invoice from the contractor, or a lot of times we'll see big general contractors that have pass-through for smaller companies that they're wholly owned subsidiaries. For example, we're auditing a project right now in Washington for another tribe where they have a wholly owned subsidiary equipment company, and they're billing it to the project like it's a third-party rental, but really they're third-party renting from one of their own companies. So, and there's admin fee on that, there's a warehouse fee, and I think there's a maintenance fee on that. All three of those would not be allowable if it was billed from the general contractor. But since they're billing it from a subsidy, it wasn't being noticed or caught. So understanding those relationships that the general contractor has and with its suppliers or with its other subsidies is key. So Pam, I think we have another polling question.
Yes, we do. We have another polling question. So have you seen or been part of a project with what would be considered excessive change orders? And if you can just select from the options on here, and we'll get your selections then recorded. And this is another way, again, if you need CP credit, we'll just need you to answer these polling questions. So we'll just give it, just a few more seconds here before I close the poll questions. And we hope you're finding this information helpful so far. And just a quick reminder, if you've got any questions, so far regarding the presentation, feel free to submit those using that Q&A inbox there. All right, so I think I'll close the poll now. And Peder, let's take a look at the results.
Yeah, this isn't surprising at all. A lot of times we get brought in as an audit firm when tribes or organizations realize, hey, all of a sudden I'm at 20% of change orders. And really what the gray word is excessive here, what is considered excessive, what is considered normal for a project. And there isn't a magic number or a percentage of total contract value we would consider excessive or not. I will say, though, as a general contractor, it is a profit center, change orders, and also subcontractors. It is a way for them to make up for items that they might have missed in the bid. It is an area where they can get additional costs or make up for costs that they might have low bid or bid red on the original project. So it is something that you want to have tight controls around and have a good control and review process of change orders. Another key is the reviewing change orders is reviewing them timely and as they come. A lot of times we see general contractors want to compile all the change orders or the RFI or change order request into one big change order. And the reason they do that is because it makes it a lot easier to include things that probably shouldn't have been included. Understanding what markups and fees are allowable. We just got done with an audit for another tribe, and it had to do with change order markup. And it was specifically, had nothing to do with the general contractor, it had to do with the markup subs were putting on their contract. So in the general contractor's contract, subs were allowed a maximum of 8% markup for any and all change orders. that language wasn't included in the subcontracts with any of the subcontractors, so the general contractor didn't include that. And so then the project had large change orders, and what it ended up happening is that there was 15 to 20% put on most markups. We saw, I think the final number for this project was $950,000 in excessive markups related to change orders. So, and purely down to the subcontractor level. So understanding and reviewing these change orders, what cost is allowable in the change orders and what percentage fees and markups are allowable, and having visibility in the change orders. The danger with change orders is that they're sole source negotiations. When a subcontractor does the original, they're competitively bidding that work. So you're relying on a fair price based off the being competitively bid. Once it's a change order, it's a sole source negotiation. They're no longer having to competitively bid this. They're no longer having to put their production factors out there competitively to try to get the work. So how do you evaluate it? A lot of times you can review what costs were actually incurred, or you need an architect, an engineer firm, a PM firm, an auditor to be able to go in and look at those and validate those against industry indexes, against there's a lot of different industry indexes out there that you can look at how many feet of drywall can you hang an hour or per man hour. That's the level of reviews you want to do on these change orders. And then my final one is the right to audit clause. So this is important even if you don't think you're going to have an audit on a project, or obviously we hope nothing comes up. In an AIA document under Article 10, it's in there. But it isn't where we've seen, it can be something that the contractor, when they do their red line of the contract before, when you guys are doing your negotiation, it's something they might try to limit or remove from the project. No good general contractor would want to remove this because they feel like they're going to bill you fairly over the life of the project. Really having the right to audit and the right to go look at the accounting records of the general contractor is something that you should have, specifically in a cost reimbursable environment. Even if you never hope to use this right, it's something that you want to have, just like the insurance or the indemnification language. They're all items that you want to keep and have. So kind of transitioning out of the specific cost elements, we're going to talk a little bit about the controls, and there's really 5 different areas of construction project. There's the planning, programming, design, and programming and design can kind of be interrelated. Then there's the construction, and then the completion and closeout. And really each one is interrelated because things you're doing at the planning and programming stage, you're hopefully gearing towards a clean completion and closeout. Minimize your punch list. Quick transition. How do you transition it? And the controls, when you're looking at different controls, and we can provide this information out to anybody on the call so that they can look through this and we can answer any questions on specific areas. But really it's having controls around each one of these areas specifically so your project's set up for the most success. And Pam, I think it's our final polling question.
Yes, this is the final polling question for today. Do you have a way of identifying excessive and or non-compliant charges? So again, if you could just make your selection, and again, this is the last polling question for today's webcast, and if you need CPE credit, you would need to answer at least 3 of these 4 polling questions. So if you could just take a few seconds here and make your selection. Yep, and when you're ready, just make sure to hit the submit button, and yep, and then we'll get your answers recorded. So just a few more seconds here, and I'll get ready to close the polling question, and we can see the results. So I'll go ahead, and I think we can close the poll question now. Hey, Peter, here are the results.
Sure. Again, kind of across the board here, and really what we're going for, and hopefully what this presentation is getting at, is some of the controls that some control areas where you'd want to have controls and some areas where it's important and where there is risk for your organization. So the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about where are specific areas you want to have controls. And we can talk in more detail, but really payment application controls is your way on a monthly basis of reviewing the cost that's being charged to the project. So you want to have controls around the approval. Who needs to approve it? What are they doing with their approval? A lot of times we want to see a signature. As an auditor, I want to see somebody that signed off saying, yes, I approved it and I reviewed it for this specific. And a lot of times the project manager is reviewing it for a different reason than the accounting is within the tribe. What are they reviewing? Accuracy. Is the billing accurate? Do the numbers tie out to what's being billed? Is there support for all of the items included in the schedule of values? Is there owner approvals needed regarding personnel or equipment? A lot of times, specific cost elements might need prior written owner approval. Has that been given? It hasn't. Why is it being brought up? The contractor bidding controls over subcontractors, we talked about that a little bit earlier. That's really important in the self-perform work. Really where an audit can come in. An audit can be involved. A lot of times we get brought in at the end of a project, or an auditor will get brought in at the end because there's issues, and the focus is cost recovery. It doesn't look like, I mean, it's a great thing to do if you're having problems, but really we say if you can bring in, the earlier you can get an auditor involved, hopefully it's getting rid of those issues you're going to have at the end of the project. So really contracts review, looking at the allowability of cost and what's not allowable, and then a three-step audit process is traditionally what we see the most of. An initial where we look at the control environment, a midpoint audit where this usually happens, so the initial audit usually happens at about 10 to 15 to 20% of project complete. And what you're looking at is a control environment and the initial costs that have been billed. The midpoint audit usually happens around the 50 to 60% complete. And this is looking at are the controls that are in place, are they effective? And also is truing up and looking at the cost that's been billed. And then the closeout, of course. And the key is timing with the closeout is you really want to do this after substantial completion before you've released retention. And this can be a very tight window. Sometimes it's a little bit longer window. Really, you want to have that audit report in hand before you release retention. Because once you release retention, again, you're losing a lot of leverage. And then change order controls. We talked in depth on change orders, but really understanding what controls you have in place to review and evaluate, making sure you're not duplicating scope, making sure that you're processing them timely, and also making sure that the costs are allowable. Here's a number of risks where we talked about some of these risks and then good controls you can have around them. What my biggest takeaway is your contract for this project, understanding what is in your contract and what's not in your contract is maybe the biggest factor in the project team you have managing it. Really, because what's going to come down to what's allowable and what's not allowable in that project is in your contract. So really spending the time up front, getting the contract right and getting the control environment right, it will lead to the most success I think you can have on your project. These are all items that obviously every owner and tribe here is hopefully looking at gaining. So when we talked about construction control results, you're hopefully having tighter internal controls, you're reducing errors, you're improving communication, ultimately you're protecting your stakeholders' funds.
Well, Peter, you've certainly given us a lot to chew on. I don't know about the rest of our audience, but I'm kind of alarmed at just all the items that can go wrong. Again, and I know we've just barely scratched the surface of these proper controls to have in place. So it looks like you've got a slide here that kind of recaps what are the key takeaways for tribes to as they're leaving the webcast today. Go through these items in some detail as to the most critical items for tribes.
Sure, and really if you have a new project or you're planning on a project, it's coming down the pipe, whether it's 3 months from starting or whether it's 2 years from starting, it's never too early to look at what controls you have in place for where you are and how the project's going to transition and what controls you need to have in place. What team members do you have in place? What resources do you have and what resources you don't have in place? If you're partway through a project and you're having a tough time, do we need to bring in extra help in order to manage the project? Being able to look at what you have, your organization, and your project, and really having a critical eye and seeing if there is risk, how do you share those risks up? And that's moving forward. These are areas where an auditor can help you, where you can work with your project manager, your architect to have you help you, or your facilities group. It really is a team approach to these projects, and making sure everybody's on that same page moving forward is, I think, an ideal situation.
Well, that leads us to the question and answer portion. We still have a few minutes, so if you do have any questions, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or if a question comes up at a later point, you can certainly always contact us. We have a very easy email address. It's tribes@mossadams.com. That will get routed to the proper people to answer your questions. So again, feel free after the presentation to utilize that email address. Again, it's tribes@mossadams.com. So Pam, what else do we need to cover for today?
No, I think it was a great presentation. So I just want to say thank you, Peder, and thank you to Brian for a great presentation today. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CP credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet in order to receive credit. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your CPE certificate is available to download now in the CPE icon at the bottom of your screen. Just open the icon and click the printer icon in the lower right corner to download a PDF copy of your certificate. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Again, if you've got any questions, here are the contact information for our presenters today. So feel free to reach out to them if you've got any questions regarding the content presented today. And finally, here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.